Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing amazing today. Today, we have another Tribunate video called Origins of the Grain Dole. Obviously, this is a very popularis thing. Origins of the Grain Dole. We shall jump right in. Let's go.
Nostalgia for the culture and architecture of ancient Rome tends to gloss over the fact that thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of freeborn Romans spent the entirety of their lives precariously close to the poverty line. Instead of
Right, and more so obviously in the city, and that's usually where they would go dwell.
relishing the philosophy, art, and literature of their society, these plebs spent the majority of their waking hours thinking of just one thing:
Food.
getting enough bread to survive the day.
Yeah.
Though conquest, slavery, and plunder gave upper-class Romans unprecedented wealth and power, chronic poverty remained a constant problem throughout the life of the city. This certainly wasn't unique to Rome, but it paradoxically grew exponentially worse as the Roman state became richer. Though the successions of the plebs tell us that there was always a motivated contingent of the working class willing to mobilize, the specific problem of bread enters our sources in the 2nd century BC, as the latifundia estates of the wealthy led to a precipitous decline in subsistence farming in Italy.
I do know, like, the Grain Dole became a continuous. I'm not sure. I think the Gracchi brothers brought it into light, but I'm not sure where it predated. If it predated.
With the slave labor force multiplying and smallholders being forced out by the estates, cattle breeders, or suburban developers, Rome saw the steady rise of a landless proletariat. The problem of dwindling farms was taken up by the reformist Gracchi brothers.
There you go.
Despite their blue-blooded aristocratic pedigree, the brothers understood the need for the patricians to reduce their holdings in order to rebuild Rome's agricultural base of yeoman farmers. The brothers served as tribunes of the plebs, and despite the fact that they were clearly acting in the interests of the state itself and the majority of its citizens, the brothers were both murdered by reacting.
And of course, they were murdered more towards, this is where you get the social war precursor with the optimates or the Senate majority, aristocratic majority, versus the populares, and there's split conversations of each.
Reactionary aristocrats. However, prior to his assassination, Gaius Gracchus laid the foundation for the most ambitious welfare program in the ancient world, one that transferred the duty to care for the poorest citizens from the private charity of patrician nobles to the Roman state itself. Initially, the program was nothing more than a subsidy that allowed for a set amount of grain to be purchased at a specific cost. Though it pales in comparison to what the grain dole eventually became, it cannot be overstated how radical this program was, since it took steps to sever the bonds of patronage that patricians had long used to ensure family loyalty among the plebeians. According to the legislation passed by Gaius Gracchus in 123 BC, the Republic would sell 5 modi, or about 72 pounds, of wheat to every citizen at the price of 6 1/3 asses. In addition to,
and of course, we went over the currency yesterday, or depending on when you're watching this, in a previous video about Tribunate. So that's very cheap for that price.
Cutting out middlemen and patrons, Gracchus ensured that the state would pay for the
And these right here, I'm not sure he's going to mention it, are like, I think ovens. Pretty sure they're ovens.
Transport of the grain, and he constructed vast storehouses to provide stability against price shocks.
Oh, they're storehouses? It could be. They look like ovens to me, based off what I've seen prior. But storehouses would make more sense given the amount of these.
In the event of a bad harvest. The supervision of the grain supply had long been the responsibility of the civic aediles, and the inauguration of this program made the office more influential. Like most things in Rome, there was a religious aspect to the grain supply itself. In Latin, the term used for grain supply was curia annonae, literally meaning the care of Annona, for she was the goddess that personified grain harvest and logistics. Furthermore, the grain dole was distributed from the Temple of Ceres on the Aventine Hill. This goddess was central to plebeian identity, undergirding popular support for Gaius Gracchus and his program. Though a massive boon to the poor of Rome, the grain dole was far from a true redistributionist project, and certainly does not merit the socialist label it can sometimes receive. In addition to not altering control over the means of production, the dole was financed not by higher taxes on the wealthy, but by an increased tax burden on the provinces. Sicily was initially the most important source of grain, though North Africa was also critical, and
which obviously comes into play. Of course, we talked about the civil war, the great civil war between Caesar and Pompey, and these regions, Sicily, North Africa, became important pawns in the game of the civil war because of said bread and and even in the future we call Egypt as the bread basket. So some of these regions can become so important as pawns to the whole system.
Egypt would emerge as the true breadbasket of Rome after being annexed by Augustus.
There you go.
Provinces bore the burden through increased requisitions, because throughout the greater part of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, Roman citizens living in Italy no longer paid taxes, other than fees associated with imports and on manumissions. Despite the fact that it imposed no burden on them, the Roman elite despised the system, just as they despised the urban poor themselves.
It's probably more or less like a classist type system. And I mean, well, it's not a classist type system. It is one. But in terms of like the rhetoric and the disdain for, like I said, the poor, it might even be like classist systems back then might be in kin to like divine right of kings, divine right of gens or families. So it could be almost predestined to someone to believe why they are in a certain family and why they have certain wealth, rather it be a trickling of common chance at the end of the day.
Cicero described recipients of the grain dole as the wretched starving mob.
Good job, Cicero.
The bloodsuckers of the treasury.
You can tell what side of the aisle he was on. He was definitely an optimist, even though he was a moderate optimist.
Still, they recognized its popularity, and there were no efforts to abolish it outright by the conservative aristocracy until the arch-reactionary Sulla seized power as dictator. Using his tyrannical power, he abolished the dole, but his reforms did not last long.
No.
Rooting out corruption and price gouging in the city's grain supply would remain a central issue for the populare reformers that courted Rome's primary expanding demographic, the urban poor. The radical tribune Saturninus won office in part by establishing credibility through the effective supervision of grain imports at the port of Ostia, and built a massive popular following by advocating initiatives to further subsidize the price of grain. An ally of Gaius Marius, Saturninus was elected tribune 3 successive times, before the Senate organized a reactionary plot against him that resulted in his assassination in 100 BC.
And you can see a theme here, just like ongoing theme.
On the eve of the social war, class conflict in Rome intensified, and the tribune Drusus proposed redistribution of land and an expansion of the grain dole. He too was murdered before this legislation could be passed, and his death caused the issue to disappear for several years. After being eliminated by Sulla and subsequently reinstated, the dole took another step towards providing adequate support for Rome's poor when the radical tribune Clodius advanced a bill to provide free grain to 320,000 Roman citizens. Carried in 58 BC, this reflected a major component of the reform agenda being driven by Julius Caesar and the populares. Cicero estimated that the expanded grain dole accounted for 1/5 of the state budget at this time.
That's a lot. Wonder what like the pie chart would look like though, like if we did all the splits.
Certainly lavish for the time, but this pales in comparison to what modern states are expected to spend on the welfare of their citizens.
True. Like Social Security for the United States is like a huge line item. Like Medicare being another one for the United States, which are subsidized. Obviously, Rome didn't really have a healthcare system, or like a subsidized way of healthcare. So, I'm just wondering what that pie chart. Probably military after Marius reforms. Grain dole, probably maintenance and architecture and public works, and probably a line item for religious works, some other stuff probably as well.
Because the land question had never been fully resolved, the passage of this generous addition to the grain dole encouraged the rural poor that had been struggling to make ends meet in the countryside to move to the city. Since the dole was only available to citizens, the wealthy even began freeing slaves that had outlived their usefulness. Now that they were fed at public expense, masters looked to cut costs that they had been hesitant to cut earlier out of fear of the social stigma that they would incur if their freedmen clients were seen begging for food.
So I guess that's a net positive, even though you're still attached to being a slave owner. It's a net positive.
The increased urban proletariat would play a significant role in the armed street clashes that punctuated the 50s BC, the last stretch of time in which the Republic's politics could be said to be functioning as intended. Working-class collegia organized around Clodius to push back against the conservative finance street gangs of Milo. The urban strife culminated in the murder of Clodius by Milo's gangs in 52 BC. Let me know if you are seeing the trend regarding the fate of popular reformers in the late Republic.
Continuous. And hey, Caesar was technically like a popularis. He was like a, in my opinion, he was like on the outskirts of the Optimates. And over time, obviously, he led a popular uprising by being the polar opposite of Cicero at the end of the day. I mean, he was very similar to not Cicero. I meant Pompey. He's very similar to Pompey in a lot of ways, but in terms of some of the polarizing issues, he was more aligned to like the Gracchi brothers in some sense.
Clodius's supporters retaliated by burning down the Curia, which was the primary meeting place of the Senate.
Yeah.
In response to the chaos, the Senate removed the last remaining democratic fig leaf of the Republic and appointed Pompey as emergency overseer of the grain supply, and then later as sole consul. The move was as unprecedented as it was unconstitutional, and the Republic was dead well before Caesar crossed the Rubicon.
Yeah,
Still,
that's true.
Cross he did, and after the fierce civil war between Caesar's Populari faction and the aristocracy represented by Pompey, Caesar took steps to simplify the dole and root out fraud. As dictator, he reduced the number of recipients to just 150,000 names. Though this was more politically viable, thanks to his passage of land reform in Italy and the funding of colonization efforts for 80,000 citizens abroad, our sources indicate that it was still very unpopular.
It was unpopular in principle.
But I suppose that one of the perks of winning a civil war and ruling as dictator for life is that public opinion doesn't interfere with the imposition of your agenda. Caesar increased the number of...
But most of the public liked him, you know? It was most the Optimates that did not like him.
aediles from 4 to 6, with the new magistrates deemed the aediles cerealis and focused entirely on the ready supply of cheap grain. He also took steps to rein in the unchecked growth of the grain dole, adding new names to the list only when a vacancy appeared as the result of the death of a citizen or when a recipient moved out of the city. The end result was a two-tiered system of Roman residence, where those who had long resided in the city maintained access to the dole, but newcomers were placed on a long waiting list. We do not know if this was Caesar's long-term plan. As with so many popular campaigners before him, he too was assassinated. But this reform, like many of the ideas he was working to implement during his brief reign as dictator, was abandoned after the Ides of March. As princeps, his successor Augustus would raise the number of eligible residents to 320,000.
Doubling.
And though he reduced the number slightly after this, it would be the last time the dole shrank in size. From now on, it would only continue to grow.
With the population growth as well.
Just like the wealth, influence, and population of the empire.
What a video. I think I understand a lot more about the grain dole now. Obviously, it's a subsidized program that really combated the overwhelming population of people that had to move and dwell into the city who did not have the means or land or status to have a family taken care of with the demand that it would cost, especially going directly to the supplier versus having middlemen. Really shrunk the cost of the grain to allow for something like this. You can one of the quotes, of course, from the Gracchi brothers is when they came back from I think Iberia, or it was either Iberia or Sardinia. They just noticed, you know, all these uh, all these foreign slaves, because when you conquer people, when you capture people, they become slaves. So there was just tons of just aristocracies uh, just ruling the land, and then you have all the slaves within the land just taking up so much opportunity for people that may have served, which of course coincided with so much that had to be changed, which and there's so many variables to this as well. But the bottom line is the income disparity between the aristocracy and well, at its center, the populares, the regular people, was so drastic that subsidizing had to happen. So this had to happen, or you would have uprising. You know, bread and circus. We talked about that. So you have to have a circus, but you also have to have a bread. And if you don't have like a floor for the most vulnerable of your population, you're gonna have a similar situation to like the French Revolution. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out. Bye bye.